The Spanish-American War was not merely a clash between two nations. It was the moment that ended Spain's centuries-long reign as a colonial superpower and thrust the United States into a new role as a global empire. What began as a local revolution in Cuba soon escalated into an international conflict that redrew the map of power and influence. Cuba, Spain's prized colony in the Caribbean, had long been seeking independence. After a failed rebellion known as the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, Cuban revolutionaries regrouped and launched a second uprising in 1895. This time, the movement gained much more attention from the United States, which had significant economic interests in Cuban sugar plantations and deep political sympathies with the island's struggle for self-rule. Public support for Cuban independence was fanned by sensationalist reporting in U.S. newspapers. Journalists like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer used yellow journalism, stories filled with exaggeration and emotional appeal, to turn the tide of American opinion in favor of intervention. Graphic accounts of Spanish atrocities, some true and some fabricated, dominated headlines and stirred outrage among readers across the country. Then came the pivotal moment. On February 15, 1898, the American battleship USS Maine, sent to Havana to protect American citizens, exploded under mysterious circumstances in the harbor. The blast killed 260 sailors. Though no clear evidence ever proved Spanish sabotage, much of the U.S. public and media quickly blamed Spain. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became the rallying cry, pushing the nation closer to war. Amid mounting pressure, President William McKinley, who had succeeded Grover Cleveland, reluctantly asked Congress for authority to intervene in Cuba. On April 25, 1898, war was officially declared. Interestingly, while the U.S. declared its goal was to free Cuba, Congress also passed the Teller Amendment, asserting that the United States had no intention of annexing the island. This was done to assure critics that the war wasn't a colonial land grab, but events that followed would complicate that promise. The first major combat did not take place in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific. Even before the declaration of war, Commodore George Dewey had been ordered to prepare his fleet for action in the Philippines, another Spanish colony. On May 1, 1898, Dewey's squadron entered Manila Bay and launched a surprise attack on the Spanish Pacific Fleet. The battle was swift and decisive. By the afternoon, nearly the entire Spanish fleet had been destroyed, and Dewey had secured one of the war's most significant victories. Despite this, Dewey lacked the ground forces needed to take the city of Manila, which had been partially seized by Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo. Reinforcements from the U.S. eventually arrived at the end of July. On August 13th, Dewey and U.S. General Wesley Merritt staged the so-called Mock Battle of Manila, a prearranged skirmish with Spanish troops designed to allow Spain to surrender the city to the Americans instead of to Filipino rebels. This maneuver handed the Philippines over to the U.S. and sowed the seeds for future conflict in the region. Back in Cuba, the American military focused its efforts on Spanish strongholds such as Guantanamo Bay. Starting on June 6, U.S. Marines, supported by Cuban allies, launched attacks against Spanish defenses. Though badly outnumbered, American forces succeeded in cutting communications and capturing key positions over the next several days. By June 10th, they had secured the bay. One of the most iconic moments of the war came at the Battle of San Juan Hill on July 1st. U.S. troops, including the famous Rough Riders, led by Theodore Roosevelt, charged uphill through withering gunfire. The hill was defended by 500 well-entrenched Spanish soldiers, but Roosevelt's men, supported by the African-American 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, pushed through the resistance. The Americans suffered heavy losses but emerged victorious, capturing both San Juan Hill and nearby Kettle Hill. The next day, U.S. forces moved into Santiago, and Spanish Admiral Pascual Cervera attempted to flee with his fleet. On July 3rd, the U.S. Navy intercepted and utterly destroyed the Spanish ships. Within 2 weeks, Santiago surrendered, marking a crucial turning point that essentially brought the war to a close. Diplomatic negotiations followed quickly. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Spain agreed to relinquish its claims over Cuba and ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Additionally, the U.S. paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines, a transaction that angered many Filipinos who had hoped for independence. Though the Spanish-American War was relatively short, lasting just a few months, it had far-reaching consequences. Spain's defeat marked the end of its colonial empire and the beginning of a period of domestic reform and reflection. For the United States, the war represented its first major step into international politics and military occupation beyond its borders. Not all Americans celebrated this shift. The acquisition of overseas territories sparked a fierce debate between imperialists, who believed in expanding American influence, and anti-imperialists, who saw it as a betrayal of the country's founding values. Critics pointed out the irony of a nation born from revolution now subjugating others.